I don't see many more people coming through the door. So I would say let's get started. And now, second time, very warm welcome, everybody. Presentation of the third rapid damage and needs assessment. Welcome from my side. I'm very happy to see a large number of participants again, a large number of people we've already known among our network work, and also quite a few and a good number of new faces and new participants. My name is Peter Bonin. I'll be your moderator of today. And let me quickly introduce you to what we're doing and in what framework we're meeting here. Our event is part of the German Platform for Reconstruction of Ukraine. And our platform is an initiative of the German federal government, which brings together stakeholders based in Germany who are interested and active in the reconstruction of Ukraine. Our main objective is to make Germany's contribution to reconstruction more effective and sustainable through more exchange, information, and stronger networks. And within our platform, many of you and many of the participants of the active members of the platform have expressed the wish that we should regularly offer events on current studies, analysis, and we're therefore very, very pleased today to have with us two experts from the World Bank to present us the results of the third rapid damage and needs assessment, which has been released in mid-February 2024. The RDNA is a joint endeavor of the World Bank, European Commission, United Nations, and the government of Ukraine. And with us, I'm very happy to have Susanna Stanton-Geddes and Thomas Farol. Both of them have contributed to the RDNA number 3 as co-team leaders from the World Bank side. And I would, both of you, Susanna and Tom, ask you maybe if you could then, when you introduce yourself then as well when taking over. Before handing over to the two of you, let me also come up with a little bit of technical housekeeping. As usual, and we all know from this kind of events, one thing is that the event is being recorded. And classically saying, by staying in the call, you agree with the recording, and you also agree that the recording will be shared on our website. Little piece of knowledge management here as well. And a central element for today's call, what we have, of course, we don't only want to listen, we also want to discuss, we want to exchange, and we want to have questions and answers and discussion afterwards. We will have enough time for this, but in order to structure it a little bit, my plea is please post your questions in the chat. We will collect them and try to structure a little bit and get back to you then for the Q&A session. No raising hands, but please ask and put your questions to the chat. We hope to facilitate and make the discussion then at a more concentrated flavor. Let's see how this exercise works. And now I'm handing over to our experts. Susanna, please, your turn. We're happy to have you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Before I put on the presentation on the screen, let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm a senior disaster risk management specialist. I'm based in Brussels. I worked on the Europe and Central Asia region, and I've, as you mentioned, co-led the Ukraine RDNA 3, as well as the previous 2 assessments. And before working in this region, I worked on disaster risk management in East Asia and the Pacific, also with the World Bank. And I'll pass to Tom.
Great, thanks, Susanna, and thanks for having us here. Yeah, my name is Thomas Farol. I'm a lead economist based in Washington, D.C., also with our Europe Central Asia group. working on in the sustainable development area. I'm not a disaster risk management expert, but I have, for the past two RDNAs, kind of led the piece that focuses more on the budgeting side of it and the prioritization of spending. And so I'll cover that as kind of the tail end of the presentation. So look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to now share my screen. We tried it earlier, so let's hope technology does not fail us. And I hope you can see it. Yep, great, okay. So we will present to you jointly with Tom some of the key findings of the third rapid damage and needs assessment. But before we get into the results, I wanted to just share briefly with you a summary of the objectives, the methodology, and some of the limitations of this assessment. So this is a rapid assessment that follows a global methodology that is linked to the post-disaster needs assessment. This methodology was developed by the UN, the European Commission and the World Bank, and it's used in post-disaster, but also in conflict contexts to better understand the impact of, say, a major catastrophe or a conflict, so that this kind of information can inform recovery and reconstruction planning. And this is also the objective of the third assessment. It is to conduct this kind of rapid yet consistent assessment with the global methodology to inform the planning in Ukraine. As I mentioned, this is the third assessment. It has been preceded by two previous assessments that are included on this slide as the two little pictures here. The first assessment covered the first 3 months of the war. The second assessment covered then the full year. And this third one basically covers almost 2 years of the war. It covers 22 months. So the assessment doesn't, it really takes on the information also from the previous assessments. It doesn't duplicate the amounts, but it then updates them so that all the events that happened within these 22 months of the war are considered. For those who might be familiar with the previous assessments, when you're comparing them, the third assessment also includes a bit more expanded human impact analysis, a chapter, and it includes priorities for 2024. This is what Tom just mentioned, and he led that piece of the work. What I would like to just mention as the last bit on the methodology is that there are certain limitations that we encounter. In some cases, data is not available, or there is some data sensitivity. This is not an assessment that looks at specific assets. It covers really a portfolio of assets by sector. And also the needs and priorities are assessed at sector level rather than in a different manner. And just to let you know, in terms of the structure of the report, maybe some of you already accessed it online. Basically, following the global methodology, you will see that there are chapters dedicated to specific sectors. These are social sectors like healthcare, infrastructure sectors like transport or energy. You have productive sectors like agriculture, commerce, and then you have cross-cutting sectors, including the environment. In addition, you have analysis of the economic impacts, and then also, as I mentioned, this human impact, which focuses on vulnerable groups. So that is all for the methodology, and let me then jump in and look at the results. So with the almost 2 years of the war, the impact, the human, socioeconomic impact has been tremendous, and we all witness it in daily basis in the news. There is almost 5.9 people that been externally displaced and 3.7 people internally displaced. This is as of December. There are more than 10,000 civilian deaths. This is a very conservative number. From various poverty surveys that we have seen, some 9% of families have run out of food in the month of November. We know that the vulnerable groups, be it the elderly, youth, women, etc., IDPs, are really the hardest hit. And overall, the progress to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals has been set back. Now let's look at the total figures. So the damage that we calculated across all the sectors has reached $152 billion US. And when you look at the needs, which consider basically building back better, this means modern infrastructure in line with European standards, with green, resilient principles, then this figure is 486 billion. So this is the total numbers that the assessment comes up with. Now let's break it down a little bit. And again, for those that might have seen the previous assessments, I also would like to share a comparison or a summary of the change between the RDNA 1, which is in yellow, RDNA 2 in light blue, and RDNA 3 in dark blue. So you can see that, of course, the damages and needs continue to grow, albeit not at the kind of huge pace as it was witnessed in the first 3 months of the war. Now, the total damages in this RDNA 3 are very high in the social sectors, which are shown here. They are also very large in the infrastructures that are coming up here, as well as in productive and then in the cross-cutting sectors. Housing really remains the largest sector with recorded damage. Just to give you an example, 10% of the total housing stock has been damaged or destroyed, which is impacting more than 2 million housing units across the country. In the transport sector, as I mentioned, in infrastructure, there are, for example, 8,400 kilometers of motorways, highways, and other roads that have been impacted. And the report provides, further details on this kind of damage per sector. Now, if you look at the map of Ukraine, on the left side is the total damage by region in the RDNA 2. So considering, again, just 1 year of war. And on the right side is the total damage in RDNA 3. And while you can see that the damage continues to be concentrated in the same regions as in RDNA 2, there is also notable increase. So Kievska, Zaporizhzhia, Khersonska are now reaching the 11 billion in damages, and also other regions are crossing significant damage. Now, if you think of the trajectory of the war, this is something that the series of RDNAs really tracks and shows. You've had very intense fighting in the first months and the temporary loss of government control. You had temporary attacks on critical infrastructure, but in the past months, the front line has not really significantly shifted. A major event that also is showing in the numbers that we see in RDNA 3 is, of course, the failure, the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam and hydro plant, but also attacks on ports such as Odessa and Mykolaievska region, and then alongside the Danube River. One thing that we also try to integrate into the assessment was any figures that we received on the completed restoration and repairs, and these are reflected then in the needs. So just a final slide on the damages. As I said, overall damage has not escalated as much since a year ago compared to RDNA 2, but there are sectors where the damage has increased substantially. Here are flagged in blue is the RDNA 3, and in orange is the RDNA 2. So you can see some sectors like environment, water supply sanitation obviously seen a major increase. Now, when we look at the recovery and reconstruction needs, they very much are correlated with the damages that we have seen. So again, there are large numbers related to the social sector, to infrastructure, but you can see also in productive sectors, so commerce, agriculture, irrigation, etc., and as well in cross-cutting sectors, which includes the management of explosive hazards, which is always a very expensive part of recovery reconstruction process. Some of these needs, again, also reflect improved data and estimations. Now, I think at this point, I'll pass to Tom. So Tom, just tell me when you would like to share the next slide.
Great, thanks, Susanna. So in fact, you can put you can click on there, yeah. So as Susanna said, she kind of described the assessment of the damages and the needs, and you see the needs are absolutely huge, 486 billion over the next 10 years. What we tried to do also with this RDNA, and it's something was not done in RDNA 1, and it's not really part of the methodology, the official methodology of doing an RDNA, but there's a lot of focus on, okay, how are we going to pay for this, and what should be the priorities therefore in spending. So in the RDNA 2, we started the process of kind of looking at the shorter term, particularly the next year, and saying, okay, what could be the priority areas of spending, and we did that again this time in RDNA 3, and what this slide what we want to emphasize here is that there's been a huge amount of work by the government of Ukraine to really work together across all the ministries to identify, first of all, to monitor all the different projects that are going on reconstruction and recovery, and to identify cost, identify existing funding and funding opportunities. So what you see on this slide in the back is just this database basically that's been developed by the government, where all projects and all ministries, I think there's something like 750 different projects that have been identified and are being kind of tracked and monitored. And this is important to show that the government is actively involved in identifying the priorities, and also there's been a lot done, right? So if you go back prior to the start of these RDNAs and prior to the war, government was probably spending something like 4 to 5 billion in capital expenditure in the economy overall, and so one of the issues that donors worry about is, hey, how can they absorb the kind of money that's needed and actually deliver on all these, particularly public infrastructure projects, given these massive needs, right? So this kind of process of identifying priorities is really important. And I wanted to say that if you look back last year, the government managed to disperse more than 7 billion against these needs. So there's been a huge amount of progress in meeting some of the needs. Obviously, the needs are huge and keep growing, but there's been a lot of progress in meeting the needs. So the process that we went through with government and led by the line ministries was to identify what are these priorities for 2024. Next slide. And here's just there's a lot of detail in the report, but here's just a kind of a way to try to break it down in a logical way. The numbers you'll have heard, the main number is this 15 billion. And this is the kind of public expenditures that are identified as priorities for the next year, for 2024. It doesn't, again, the needs are kind of endless, right? There's hundreds of millions in needs. This is a figure that is been identified as is basically the most important activities that could reasonably be done over the next year. It does not include all expenditures. So, for example, it doesn't include the social protection, the social transfers that go to IDPs, and the reason why we don't include that in here is because the government has committed and consistently it's part of the budget anyway. It's always been part of the budget. And so that's another, 3.5 billion. But there's 15 billion in public expenditures. These you'll see on the last slide how it splits in the different sectors. But of that 15 billion, about 9.5 billion of that is already met, right? In the sense that these are projects that have received funding either directly in the state. They're already, financed by the Treasury in the state budget, or it's coming from donors or IFIs through loans, through grants. So these are the needs that are already met, but that means there's another 5.5 billion that still need to be funded. And one of the big purposes of all of this process is for government to identify what those priorities are that need funding, so they can, in their communication with donors, it's very clear on what those priorities are. So, sorry, I just said completely the wrong thing, right? If you were listening, it's 5.5 billion that's already funded and 9.5 billion that still needs to be funded, right? So of that 9.5 billion that still needs to be funded, that breaks out into different types of expenditure. So 4.5 billion of it is public investment. There's another 1.5 billion in some other kind of we call non-capital expenditures, so, current transfers that need to be made, and 3.5 billion in subsidies and guarantees and financial support, mainly. And the reason why we separate this is because a big focus going forward is what role can the private sector play in supporting reconstruction and recovery. And so a lot of the financing needs that have been identified by government are ways in which whether it's a subsidized loan or a guarantee, but ways in which the private sector and consumers, by the way, can be kind of incentivized to make investments. And the estimation from that is that through these instruments that are being identified, the private sector could contribute up to another 11 billion to support reconstruction and recovery, both through kind of through direct investments as well as through kind of financing, purchasing of new housing stock or working capital for firms. So there's a lot of numbers in there, and I'm happy to discuss some of them in more detail. Next slide. And you can just roll all these out. I think just to kind of finalize, the report also highlights what are some of the priorities in terms of the reform agenda going forward. I think given the scale of the needs, there's a big focus from the donors and the IFIs on how can we spend more, how can we spend it better, and how can we, as I mentioned previously, how can we get the private sector to really step up in making investments? So that's all linked to the need to raise capacity in the public sector, to accelerate reforms that will enable the public sector to absorb and spend better, but also particularly to facilitate the private sector to step in. So there's a lot of there's a big reform program that's ongoing under the government's Ukraine plan, and that's all linked to the EU framework and the Ukraine facility that has been agreed. There's a lot of work on public sector capacity. So, for example, the government has adopted a roadmap for public investment management, which will really improve the ability to prioritize. So we talk about trying to identify what the priorities are, but the government doesn't at the moment. These are coming from different ministries, right? through this reform program, there'll be a much more kind of top-down way of setting priorities and choosing between the competing priorities as well in a very kind of strategic way. And a whole range of reforms that are going on to kind of promote private investment, both on the side of competition, on the side of transparency, all the kind of things that will help the private sector be in a position to make investments. And then finally, reforms that boost the capacity of local authorities as well and local communities, because I mean, we know that Ukraine has already been on a path towards decentralization, reforms, but also, delivery of so much of this is happening on the ground through local governments and local communities, and so there's a need at the same time that we talk about kind of central government reforms to also build capacity at the local level. Next slide. I think this is kind of I don't know, Susanna, if you want to summarize, or I mean, but this just kind of summarizes the big numbers again, right? Susanna talked about the damages, 152 billion, the huge recovery and reconstruction needs, 486 billion is the latest update, and then these priorities for financing for this year, which is 15 billion. Here you can see the breakdown in the different sectors. And again, just to say that each of those sectors, the needs are much higher, right? These are just what's been identified as what are the most urgent projects, essentially, that can get done in the next year. So I think we'll stop there. There's another slide which.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, thank you, Tom. I will just add that the needs, the recovery reconstruction needs, are calculated for the timeline of 10 years. So also to take that into account. So that's also another difference. The priorities are only for 2024 and are much more concentrated, I would say, than the overall needs. So here is also the link to the report that's online in English version, and we are just working on a designed version as well as on a Ukrainian version. So we can also share that with you once available. And there are also some 1-2-pager fact sheets that I'll be happy to share with you also after the meeting, as well as the presentation, by the way. The presentation we will also share. So thank you very much. That's all in summary. It's a big topic, but we try to condense it just on a few slides, and we are very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Susanna. Thank you very much, Thomas. From my side, 2 loud wows. One wow is your timekeeping. This is impressive. We've agreed, or we thought, let's talk until 4:30, and this is it to the minute. And the other wow goes to the impressive work you have obviously compiled. And when looking at our method about asking questions in the chat, this seems a bit like we have conducted a little trick, actually, because we have a lot of questions in our team ourselves, and please, nobody feel shy to post your questions. In the meantime, I have the opportunity to ask some questions I have asked myself when looking at the report and now listening to your impressive presentation. When talking about the needs and in comparison between RDNA 2 and RDNA 3, you have made a point on the different sectors, but I'd be curious to hear a bit more about, if you could go a bit more into detail or say a bit more about which sectors show a higher or lower number of needs compared to RDNA 2, and what your assessment is for the reasons behind. Could say something about this?
Sure, I can come in, or would you like to collect a few other questions?
at the moment. There is one question about cooperation and questions about not related to the RDNA. Thank you for those as well. This is an interest in the work of our platform and so on. I propose that we take up these questions through our LinkedIn group, and we will give some information on this after the discussion of the RDNA. And maybe we also right immediately take Sarah Feiner-Soli's question. And Sarah, if you want to come in on this, the issue about the costs that have those have arisen until December 23, and about further projections. This is more about understanding. Sarah, do you want to come in and express this again, or is this clear enough for Susanna, Tom to get into that one? And we might also take on the question by Florian Andrews on calculation of the level of sustainable construction, or on average cost sustainable. These are, I understand, a bit on understanding, questions of understanding. Over to Susanna and
okay. Great. So I'll kick us off on the needs. Indeed, we had a comparison on the damage RDNA 2, RDNA 3. When you look at the RDNA 2 and 3 in terms of the needs, so just a reminder, the total needs in RDNA 2 were 411 billion, and now we are talking about 486 billion. The biggest jumps are, some of the jumps are correlated closely with the damages. So, you know, the increase in housing, of course, there was a bigger increase in commerce and industry, agriculture, water supply, and sanitation. In some areas, we also were deducting the needs that were met. For example, in transport, a lot of work has been done. In some cases, we also updated baseline and damage data. So I would say a big increase is looking at the data were definitely in housing, in the agriculture linked also to the dam, commerce and industry. We were able to have more improved data also through first surveys. So so that's kind of the big picture, and we have some more details also in the report to see for others. Now, maybe to the question of costs. So indeed, the data presented is as of December 2023. We didn't make projections into the future. And it's hard to make because it really depends on the evolution of the war. Of course, we do see a trend that we also shown that you know, with the improved ability to protect, to counter missiles, etc. Of course, that contributes to the fact that the damages are not increasing exponentially, as well as the fact that in many areas the assets are simply already destroyed. So this is also one of the things that the RDNA shows, because we were not double counting the same damage 2 or 3 times. If it's already one time damaged, it remains damaged. So we didn't make projections. It would really depend on how the war evolves. Tom, I don't know if you wanted to come in on anything else, but
no, I mean, I'm happy to come in on some of the, I see some news questions that have come in on related to the 15 billion. Peter, if that's okay, or if you want to.
Yes,
here.
You see, this is a little bit of a new exercise we're trying to fulfill, and we're trying to see, can we structure things? And let's see, I try to have a look at, we've had from Michael Heisel with regard to Build Back Better and efforts that have been taken to build networks between German and Ukrainian scientists, scientists in building. Is that something you can come into directly?
I think this question on the Building Back Better networking efforts would be best placed direct to the government, to the Ministry of Restoration. As you said, Peter, at the beginning, the assessment is a joint one between the government, the World Bank, the Commission, the UN. Ministry of Restoration led the coordination process, and they're also, of course, deeply involved in the rebuilding efforts at the local level. So I think best to then connect with the government directly. Just to mention what the World Bank does, the RDNA is part of our technical assistance support. We are also providing channeling donor funds for specific projects, framework projects that are in priority sectors, for example, related to health or to energy, housing. So to give an example, for example, Japan helped to fund some of the efforts related to housing reconstruction. So in terms of collaboration, the World Bank collaborates a lot on the level of donor financing. And through this report, I mean, we were also in touch with GIZ, for example, when we were collecting some data in the emergency response sector. So there is always also collaboration at the technical level.
Okay, let's move on. There are more questions here. Another one by Charlie Rees from RAND. Do any of the 15 billion in immediate investment priorities stem from local authority requests, or are they impaired by lack of capacity for now? And the 15 billion results from national ministries' priorities. Can the two of you?
Yeah, I can come in on that. So, so it's a little bit of both, but I mean, I think it's mostly coming from the net. So it varies a lot by sector. So, for example, if you look at the education sector, a lot of the reconstruction spending is actually coming from local municipalities, and sometimes completely outside of it's not even coming. It's even being generated through local taxes that have been raised that are being used for this. And so I would say, sectors like education, sectors like municipal services and water supply and sanitation, we are getting some of the requests coming from the local authorities. But I think I would still say that by and large, it's top down from central government, and I think that's a combination of capacity, as you suggested there. There are capacity issues in local government, but also a little bit of process, right? I think it's a little bit, this is a central government-led thing. So I think in some cases there are just gaps, both in, from the ministries, also in kind of tracking the financing and everything. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Susanna, in the meantime, also for being in direct answering and question mode here, answering the question by Igor Tishenko. But we have 3 more questions from Howard Schatz. First on the issues of resilience for future attacks from Russia. How would this be, or is this being considered and handled in RDNA 3? Again, on the 15 billion, largely a holding pattern designed to help Ukraine maintain its economy and society, or is it also designed to modernize the economy in the future? And finally, did the RDNA discuss monitoring of spending and anti-corruption?
Sure. Susanna, maybe I'll start if you want to add. So on the issue of kind of resilience to future attacks, again, I think it's sector specific. So I can come to the education sector again, where a decent share of the identified priority expenditures in RDNA 2 and in RDNA 3 were to build the bomb shelters to allow in-person schooling. But there's also significant programs going on for digitalization to allow more effective remote. Which links a little bit to, and the same goes for other sectors like energy, where there's programs. But that example of digitalization in education links a bit to the second part of the question, because digitalization of education is something that government may be doing partly to allow for remote schooling, but it's also part of modernization of the system, right? And modernization of the curriculum. And so we see that again in all the sectors and in fact, it's a little bit of a challenge for the RDNA, because the RDNA as a methodology is designed to look at events and the response, the recovery from those events. In the case of here, because it's a long-going thing, modernization and growth and all of these things begin to, it's a gray line between just recovery and modernization. And I would say that if you look at the Ukraine, at the EU framework and the Ukraine facility, modernization is really at the heart of that. So I think when we look at the priorities that are in the 15 billion, and as we see what will be the government spending priorities, it really is a lot about modernization of the economy. And then finally on the question of monitoring and anti-corruption, I'm not sure how much I don't know that we directly talk much about anti-corruption in the RDNA, but what I would say is that I mentioned it on the very first slide I presented, is the government has put in place a pretty extensive monitoring process for this, particularly for looking for reconstruction and recovery spending, so that they can partly so they can show donors what's happening, right, with their money. And so I think that's in itself, that process is really a useful and helpful one. But clearly the general issue of anti-corruption is, we don't discuss it much in the RDNA, but it's at the heart of a lot of the discussions with donors, for sure.
Yeah, maybe just to complement a little bit, Tom, on the points you made. So indeed, the modernization, and this comes back a little bit also to one of the questions on the sustainable construction costs, generally modernization. So the RDNA and PDNA methodologies, as I mentioned, they take into consideration building back better. So there is no point building the old schools that were not energy efficient, etc. So that surplus, but also other elements, are taken into consideration when calculating the needs, and this is why they are so much higher. It depends sector by sector what are those specific considerations, and what figures and are used. Even in the transport sector, if you look at just modernizing the core sector, you will get a certain amount of funding needed, versus if you were to modernize and upgrade to the highest EU standard level all the roads. So it depends also sector by sector, and this building back better is really also a little bit the bridge towards modernization, because while we try to focus as much as possible on what is related to the war impact and the war related recovery construction, of course Ukraine is looking also at the focus of modernization, reforming its country in line with looking at EU membership. So there is a little bit of a blur, but also cross-cutting topic on that. And just to mention on the anti-corruption, in the recovery reconstruction section of the report, you will see the RDNA highlights the principles that were set by Lugano Conference, or the general principles that donors adhere to, and that's exactly what Tom also mentioned. That includes also anti-corruption, anti-fraud. One of the good things or positive developments is also efforts to use same transparent procurement procedures between the different donors. This can also certainly help to increase transparency in the actual construction efforts.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I allow myself to ask another question as well. With regard to financing environment internationally and increasingly constrained financing environment, could you please, of course, you've alluded to that already, but could you scrutinize a bit more, again, to the question, what strategic priorities should be seen to meet the most critical needs? If we look at the increasingly constrained financing environment, in your opinion, which sectors would that be?
Tom, I'm looking at
give
you.
You a good answer to this one. No, look, I can't say which sector. I think, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, that's the decision, and that's why we were pleased that the process was government-led here. I mean, government needs to decide its own priorities. Obviously, donors will have their priorities and will have their views, but it's really should be a government-led process. And why we also, you know, in terms of some of the key reforms, though, we are pushing for there to be a real government thinking through the priorities, because rather than them just coming up from the sectors, right? It's one thing for the sectors to define their priorities. It's another thing for the government to choose among sectors on what the priorities are. So it's, you know, so yeah, I think that's as far as we can go with that. As Susanna said, housing is obviously a huge need. But you know, it's very difficult to say, right? I mean, if we look at what I could say is that if we look at the difference between RDNA 2 and RDNA 3, we see shifts from a little bit from core infrastructure, energy, transport, to more social infrastructure and services, and the private sector, the need to kind of get the private sector going. Those are what how priorities have shifted, right? It's not a normative thing, right? It's not us saying what we think they should be, but it's what's coming from government, and that's a function of government priorities. It's also a function of a little bit of the realities on the ground as well, I think.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for allowing me to challenge you a little bit on this one. We have a comment coming in on building better and EU countries' standards on this. This is not so much on a question basis. I hope Oliver Gielis is fine with just presenting us this point. And another question on Build Back Better, on the principle in housing projects. Is this to be understood as technical standards regarding energy efficiency, or just a bit more background on this, or like global political message? Would you enlighten us with the participants on this one?
So I would say, oh, somebody wanted to come in?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, good. So as I said, it's quite sector specific, of course, when we're talking about building back better, but also a trend that we have seen comparing RDNA 2, RDNA 3. This time around, there was a lot of focus on energy efficiency. This is a subject, a cross-cutting subject, and kind of the government counterparts were asking about it and highlighting it. Related to housing, I can say that, for example, the projects that World Bank supports, they do have to adhere to all the energy efficiency standards that are set by the EU. Of course, it depends on the nature of specific projects or investments that you talk about. There are investments that might just also look at some immediate repairs, right? That would not necessarily look at the high standards, but anything related to medium long-term recovery does need to consider these full standards. Yeah, and as I mentioned, I am happy to also connect if you have any specific questions related to housing sector to our colleagues that worked on that chapter and then also are implementing one of the framework projects in this sector.
Okay, thank you for that. And maybe still when I'm looking back at the comment made on Build Back Better and the governments being well advised on request clear results before moving forwards. This, I allow myself also to challenge you a little bit again. I've been talking about priorities. I've been asking about prioritization. One thing that we are discussing in our teams a lot about, and another one, of course, coming back to the topic of reforms. In that relation, of course, here as well, we've been discussing, you hear reforms, you talk anti-corruption, corruption issues, and so on. Could you allude to that a little bit more as well? In terms of reforms, the first issue always is corruption, but what other reforms is there a recommendation from your side based on the findings of the RDNA 3? Other important urgent reforms of fields that should be addressed? Widening the scope a little bit from the classical corruption topic.
Yeah, so and I can't remember a lot of the details, right? But Susanna, feel free to come in, please. But I think what I would say is the reform. So it's not so much that what's in the RDNA report around reforms is something that kind of comes out as a kind of something we learned and said, okay, because of this you need to do reforms, right? It's more that I think there's so in terms of the donors, and you made the point that money is scarce, right? And so I think donors are rightly saying we want to make sure that our funding goes as far as it can go and delivers good results on the ground. And of course, government wants the same thing. And that relates, of course, anti-corruption is part of that, but really it goes way beyond that. And I think one thing we mentioned in the presentation is just public investment management, right? Having efficient systems for, we talk a lot about single project pipeline, having efficient systems for procurement, for monitoring, and these are, there's an anti-corruption element of it, but it's more about making strategic choices, delivering efficiently, and knowing where you stand on these things. So I think that that whole public investment management thing is part of it. The other thing I mentioned was the role of the private sector, and I think it comes across very, very strongly from all the donors, not all the donors, but most of the donors. And it's something that I would say I've seen a big shift between RDNA 2 and RDNA 3, right? And that's partly because what we saw in RDNA 2 was much more of a kind of, response to the first shock, right? Now it is about modernizing the economy, moving the economy on, realizing that the public sector cannot spend 400, cannot absorb cover the needs that are there, that we need the private sector to be able to, and what that means when I say that means the private sector in Ukraine to grow. It also means the private sector from Ukraine and outside to participate in the reconstruction and recovery, to invest. And for that, you need, and this is getting to your question about reforms, there's a lot about the business environment in Ukraine that is not necessarily conducive to as conducive as one would want it to be for the private sector. This is not something new, right? This is a legacy. And competition in some sectors is part of the issue. Regulation is part of the issue. A lot of the things that are kind of, so I can't remember some of the details, but kind of a lot of the things you would have seen in any kind of report on the opportunities for Ukraine, even if going back five years or 10 years. On that, the one thing I would maybe point you to is the report. It was listed in one of Susanna's first slides, but the IFC, which is our kind of sister organization that works mainly on private sector development, did this study. Susanna's just put it in about, I don't know, maybe 6-8 months ago, on the opportunities for the private sector in the reconstruction and recovery. And that report really sets out not only the opportunities, but quite a lot of detail around the reform environment that's needed. to stimulate the private sector. So it may be worth having a look at.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much, Susanna. Time is almost up, and thank you very much for giving us this insight into a very, it's not a nice work, to be honest, but it's a very important work, and we all know about the framework in which we're working. Thank you very much for this, and thanks to all participants also, of course, and there's a couple of closing remarks from my side. We'll have an evaluation on this issue. We'll be glad and pleased if you see you participating in this one and giving us feedback on this event. You can see it here already. In case you're interested in the work of the platform, or you have ideas for events, for topics, please get in touch with us. You see the email addresses here as well. And for anybody who hasn't yet and who wants to get connected with other actors here with us and so on, please don't hesitate to join the platform also at our LinkedIn page, as what you can see at the bottom here. And this is the moment to thank everybody again, the presenters foremost, and the participants as well. Hope to see everybody soon again for some other occasion. Thank you again, and good afternoon to everybody. Cheers.
Thanks so much for having us. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.